Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to, I think this is like flip 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't know. I've been doing this for 10 years now. I do not keep track of the numbers of these things. I also just got a bunch of, like, ceiling junk on my head. Now, anyway, so let's jump right back into where we left off in class. We were talking about the culture of the Hebrews, as well known as the Jews, as well known as the Canaanites, as also well known as the Israelites, right? So big things that we also have to talk about as well is that, like, in ancient Judea, in ancient Israel, and things like that, there were still kind of some, like, interesting little things going on and stuff like that. It wasn't necessarily perfect, but we did talk a lot today about their faith, how that outlined their culture, how they were a smaller, like, group and organization of people, how, for example, like, the Tanakh, and how that was very important to them. The Torah is only a third of that, and Abraham is their father, and also Abraham is from Ur, and, like, also kind of little things like odds and ends. Also, congrats on taking your first quiz today. We'll get those grades in ASAP. Going forward, though, there's also a kind of interesting little things. For example, marriages were completely arranged in the Hebrew culture. Women were not allowed to divorce their husbands in the Hebrew culture, so there was some second-class citizenry of women. And of course, though, this is in the 1500s BC. I'm not saying it's okay, but I am saying, like, it's not outside the norm. And then also, Jews condemned adultery for women. However, men, like being with concubines, slaves, and servants, was openly accepted. And this is one of my most interesting things I like to talk about, is this thing known as the brother law. This is actually in ancient Jewish culture, which is not a current Jewish culture, but it does exist in some of the Old Testament writings, is this idea of if a man dies and leaves behind a wife and children, that wife has to go off and actually marry the brother of that of the husband. So, like, her husband's brother, she now has to go and marry that brother. And there was apparently a special ceremony that occurred during, like, this stuff. If the man wanted to refuse to marry that widow, either he was already married or, like, he could not do it, they had to have a ceremony where he, like, took off his left shoe and, like, spit on it. And then, like, that means you didn't have to marry your brother's widow. It's a very interesting little culture. It's a lot of fun to actually really, really get into. And another really cool thing, too, is about how their education systems. So this actually plays heavily into the Jewish culture even today, when it actually had to come down to women actually educating the children at home. And they were a society of people, even in their ancient times, that heavily favored the education of all people within their community. They believed that their community needed to be educated to actually prosper and go forward as a civilization. Also, they traded with the Phoenicians a lot, mainly due to the fact that every single Jewish family specialized in a very specific craft. And then they would actually teach the technology and the craft work to their sons, and so the sons could carry on the entire process. Now, this even actually goes forward into thinking that as an ancient culture, it relates to them, for example, in the growing European perspective of being able to have a trade and a job, and your son would apprentice underneath you. That is why so many families were long-standing people in the community that were heavily involved in certain industries, and they were actually people that needed to be depended on even when they were in Europe. And they also had dietary restrictions arose on how to properly slaughter and process meat, which developed into the kosher diets that are outlined in the Torah. Now, there's a really, really important word that we also need to write down really, really fast, though, and that's kind of understanding what happened to them after this, right? So some of y'all probably actually thought of or heard or, like, understand that the Jewish faith and the Jewish people that existed as the Hebrews during this era is a really, really big deal, that, like, they didn't stay there, right? Where did they end up? Where did they go? Why did they end up in Europe for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, for centuries? And why did they end up spread out? And why did you have Jews everywhere rather than just having Jewish people inside of Israel during the ancient time period? That actually has a very special word, and it's called a diaspora, right? So diaspora. You need to write that down. The diaspora occurred mainly when they started being taken over and conquered by other individuals, right? And one of the biggest ones and one of the worst ones is the one that we're going to spend the bulk of this flip talking about now. So we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to jump over to this other group. So over in the east, going from their empire from 900 BC to, 900 BC to 600 BC, for 300 years, these people conquered and dominated the entire Fertile Crescent and actually took over the Jewish kingdoms of Israel and Canaan. And when this happened, the Assyrians, is what they were known as, forced the Jewish people off of this land, right? Causing them to spread and spread out and end up in different areas of the world. Hence why it was referred to then as the diaspora. So the first diaspora occurred as late as the Babylonian period. Several subsequent diasporas occurred even during the Assyrian period and going on, so forth and so on. Now, the big thing about it is also, though, is that the Assyrian Empire deserves its own focus, right? So now we're going to take a second to kind of just talk about the Assyrian Empire, who they are, where they're coming from, who they are as a people, and how they kind of affected the entire growth of the ancient time. So the geography of Assyria is very, very important. Well, let's talk about where they're located, right? So Assyria was located in the modern-day base of the Zagros Mountains, right? They're actually right down here, okay? So that's the original area and founding of what is now, or what was known as Assyria. Also, very, very closely, in this area right here as well, located too, this was actually one of their capitals, Ashur and Nineveh. The thing about it is now located in modern-day Syria, right? Hence why Syria is called Assyria, right? Or the Assyrians are referred to as the modern-day Syrians. Assyria, though, if it's located at the base of those Zagros Mountains, that means it's going to be a part of that area we've always referred to as the Fertile Crescent, right? It's going to be a part of what we would call Mesopotamia. So the Assyrians popped up much later in time, though. They're going to go from 900 BC to 650 BC, and in the process of that means that they came after the late Bronze Age collapse. So they are actually one of the larger kingdoms to pop up following the late Bronze Age collapse. They were right next to the Tigris River, and at its height, Syria expanded to cover parts of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and even Egypt, right? So resources in this empire were plentiful, and it contributed to their extremely fast growth. Because look at what I told you, 900 BC to 600 BC is when the Assyrians lasted. That's not a very long period of time. They were kind of like a flash in the pan, right? But in that process of flashing in the pan, they grew their resources very, very well and grew to be very, very large. And also, to continue on talking about the Assyrians, you got to talk about their geographic features as well. Now, a big thing about it is the geography where they were located, the base of the Zagros Mountains, was extremely flat in front of them to their southern tier, right? So behind them, in their northern tier, they had the Zagros behind them, and then in front of them, there was a massive amount of exposed and flat land. Now, this made them very prone and open to attack, right? This is going to heavily influence their culture because they're going to develop a very warlike behavior from their early foundings of having to constantly protect themselves from attack to the front. They repelled invaders by setting up a massively strong army. And since they were able to use the geography to their advantage in the terms of using the military to push back the entire growth of other empires or keep them from being invaded, it created in them a sense of very cultural militaristic nature, right? They developed a lot of warlike behaviors. And the other big thing about it, land and resources-wise, is where they were located at the base of those Zagros Mountains. They have a super, super fertile land on the banks of the Tigris River, and they had tons of natural resource. Particularly, stone was a massive natural resource that they had access to, right? So this right here is a fantastic example of Assyrian art, right? They were very, very well known for doing what's known as recessed carvings, and we'll actually show you a couple more of those here in a second. And you can even see a mimic or an aspect of their polytheistic religion. This right here is Assur, and Assur was the main god that actually was embodied in their government as well, and it is believed that Assur bestowed ruling power onto all the kings of Assyria, right? Kind of like Ra, very similar to Amun-Ra, and actually going through Horus and other things we talked about as well. Now, going into it though even further, Assur, when he was blessing these leaders with this different ideal, it was kind of the idea that he was ruling through them. So that means that Assyria has a theocracy, right? They also have a theocratic government as well. Now, Assyrian culture and religion is going to keep going forward, though, and growing because they created that massive military structure, that massive militaristic behavior. And what's going to happen is their art will expand, their economics will expand. For every little group or kingdom they take over, they began to just grow and grow and grow. Biggest ones, though, like I said, their art is oftentimes recessed carvings. And in a lot of their art, it's very violent in nature. For example, they depicted lion hunts and other battles and wars or kingly power and things like that. For example, this right here is a man hunting a lion right there who has actually been shot in the head with an arrow, and he's actually legit choking this thing, right? So Assyrian art, very intense. And stone was a massively important resource to them. because there was a massive abundance of it. And since there was abundance of it, they used it to build their buildings, build their temples, build their larger scale architecture, right? Assyrians excelled also early on in working with bronze, which was very plentiful at the beginnings of their empire in their earliest foundings, right? So as we know, though, the Bronze Age will collapse, and that's going to give way to a new Metal Age that we're going to talk about here in a second. But also, as they began to grow and take over other kingdoms and things like that with this militaristic behavior, they also adopted their own writing system. And they actually adopted a form of Akkadian cuneiform and Aramaic and merged the two of them together and created a writing system that was completely their own. Stuff like this right here, this is actually in one of the national museums in Italy. It is a massive sculpture that also, again, demonstrates Assyrian art, and it actually shows the blending of like their animalistic art forms and also their religion with the winged gods and also kingly figures actually melded together. That right there is very, very old, but very, very big. It's like I saw it while I was in Italy. This right here, another one, is actually a recessed tile carving of a lion. This one right here is of an ibex, right? And this right here, another big one, of several men in a chariot going to storm something, right? Because, again, they reflected a lot of their culture and their art in their militaristic behavior, right? So their militaristic behavior will be shown. This right here is an ostrich hunt right here, which ostriches is scared the living daylights out of me. Their knees are on the back ends of their legs. I don't like it. It creeps me out. And then also, as they blended and culturally diffused, they began to take over more areas, they began to adopt things from all over their empire, right? For example, this right here is a cuneiform tablet from one of the kingdoms that they took over, and they began to adopt the very, very culture, very their own. Now, in the process of doing that, though, as they're taking over all these different places, Assyrian policies will begin to change. So you have to understand that the Assyrians were extremely militaristic, right? Their policy was to dispatch conquered peoples to other areas of their empire. So every time they would take someone over, 9 times out of 10, it would be preceded by a very, very large battle, which would actually cost the lives of a lot of their enemies, not their own personal soldiers, but yes, of their enemies. And what they would do to prevent future rebellion is they would actually take groups of these people and put them in different areas of the empire to prevent them from uniting against them, right? Their goal was to destroy the enemy's country or enemy country's sense of nationalism and pride, right? By separating all of them, you're fragmenting their culture to prevent them from ever wanting to rise up against you. And also, in their militaristic nature, this right here is actually the copy of a carving following an Assyrian battle. And as you can see, they actually kept count of how many people they killed in a battle by counting the different severed heads in a pile, right? So that is just the tip of the iceberg, though, because the Assyrians are going to begin to expand rapidly with their strong military, and they're going to be able to keep these territories under them using a heavy amount of force. So during their height, between 850 and 650 BC, the Assyrians defeated kingdoms in Syria, Palestine, Babylon, Egypt, the Hebrews, and Phoenicians. And when they actually took over the Hebrews, it caused that what again? Diaspora, right? It caused that diaspora and caused a massive movement of the Jewish people into other areas of the world. So in this process, which is very important to understand, they are going to continue to grow, and their technology becomes even more intense. They begin to segment their military, right? So right here you can see orders of different soldiers and groups, right? You have a shield man who is right here, who is used to block archers, and you have a storming soldier right here in front of him who is holding what now? What's he got in his hand? Oh, I don't know, just the severed head of another individual, right? So this makes a very complex military that has many different classes. So as their military began to grow and take over things, they created the largest standing army that the Mediterranean and the Middle East region we now refer to Southwest Asia that the world had ever seen. So not only did they advance technologically speaking, they also created tactics to capture other kingdoms. Because as these kingdoms were aware that the Assyrians were growing, they were creating walls to defend themselves. They were creating their own archers to defend themselves. But the Assyrians always stayed a step ahead, right? If a country or a kingdom actually threw up a wall to prevent them from coming in, the army would literally draw battering rams into the city and break the wall down, right? And I'll show you a picture of one here in a minute. They had siege tanks that would actually legit roll into the edge of the actual wall and then actually would throw ladders and things like that all the way up the walls. They would literally mount ladders against these walls and cities and climb into a city stronghold, while the archers would launch arrows standing behind those shield men to cause the people inside the other kingdom to get down and duck and cover. So the Assyrian army even used these people known as sappers. And sappers were a really neat figure. They were these people that would actually dig underneath a wall to weaken it structurally to make it fall down, right? So they would literally just dig tunnels underneath the wall, and the wall's base would become so fragile and so chaotically unstable that it would go, and it would actually just come flying down. So they then would organize all the information. So this is a really interesting thing about Assyria as well that's very, very important. They would then go into the kingdom after killing as many people as they needed to, making examples of them, which is what we're going to talk about in about 2 seconds. They would then collect all of the intelligent information that that kingdom had to offer, whether it be mathematics, astronomy, certain different languages. For example, they had a king that actually led over them during the height of their empire period, where they actually, like, he was well known for being able to read and write in several different languages, right? So in this process, they would take all of these different items, store them, write them on scrolls, and put them into storage in a room, effectively creating the very first world's libraries, right? By trying to take the best of every single place they took over. So this right here is a good example as well. As you can, oh, whoa, what was that? As you can see right here, there's actually sappers digging underneath that wall while these shieldmen and archers are launching a barrage at the kingdom that they're actually trying to destroy, right? This right here is an example of one of those Assyrian siege tanks that would actually be used to batter ram into a wall and try to bring it down. Now, this one is also really crazy. This is a recessed carving found from the Assyrian period around like 800 BC or 600 BC. And on this, you can actually see, if you look closely, that they were very well known also for making examples of fallen people. So this right here, we believe, is actually taken out front of a Jewish village that they had taken over. To prevent the people from rebelling against them, they actually took 12-foot-long pikes, or like long sticks, and actually hung people's bodies from them to try and serve as a message of, do not rebel against us, right? We are going to destroy your city, take your things, and then also put your people on like pikes. That's terrifying. The Assyrians are also not only militaristic, but they also were very, very chaotic and aggressive in preventing other people from rebelling. They also oftentimes would do this, which is a process known as flaying. Flaying is when they would actually literally bring leaders of cities out into the public and remove their skin off their body while they're still alive. So I don't know about y'all, but I definitely don't want to live under the Assyrians, right? So as the Assyrian military grew and began peeling the skin off people, putting people on sticks, their army became even more organized, right? They had several different specialized units. They were personal security for the kings, archers, spearmen, rams, and foot soldiers, and sappers. There also were several different occasions, apparently, where Assyrians would come up to geographic obstacles that they would then have to deal with. Now, in this process, when they came up against these geographic obstacles, they would legit try to figure out ways around them. So, hypothetically speaking, this right here is actually apparently taken from one time when the Assyrians needed to take over a city that was located on an island, right? And so the people that were on the island were like, can't get to us now, nerds. If you try to make a bridge or something like that, we're just going to knock it down. So what's up? So the Assyrians apparently then went into the woods outside of that island kingdom, killed a bunch of animals, took the skin off the animals, tied it off, blew into it, and made life preservers that they could then swim across that water with to attack them directly. And then once they got over there, they then built a bridge to get there and siege that entire city. No one could keep these people from coming. The Assyrians then organized all conquered territories into what you would refer to now as an empire, right? So by doing that, they would organize it into several different districts. And the kings would then pick governors to make it so the dependent territories were supported by the rulers that sided with Assyria. They would be like, okay, Jim, you're going to be in charge of that area over there, and somebody else I trust is going to be in charge of that area over there. And they basically created an infrastructure to prevent any rebellions, right? Assyria protected those dependent territories from invasions because they were believed to be protecting their own financial investment. And then also they turned a lot of people that they had conquered into military servers and slave labor. So in this process, the governors were selected for a very specific reason, which is similar to the Persians when we get to them as well, to prevent rebellion and revolt. If the governor heard that a village or place may rebel or revolt against them, possibly cop an attitude, the Assyrians would then show up and execute a massive population of the people that live there to prevent them from doing it again or trying to get out ahead of them. And what they did this with is a very important thing. They were the very first people to technologically create a process of smelting iron, right? The Assyrians were some of the very first people to notice the quality and efficiency of iron over bronze, right? So they came after the Bronze Age collapse. When the Assyrians first started, they were smelting bronze out of copper and tin, right? Melting these two things together. But then they realized, and an important component of their military structure was that iron was a better metal. It held an edge longer. It was more durable. It was stronger. And it could even be used for axles on siege weapons like chariots. Oh my God, like look at this. The Assyrian war chariot of the 9th century BC, and this guy's head is just on his back, and this chariot is rolling over him, right? So as you can see, this efficiency of iron smelting, libraries, organized militaries, it's a terrifying thing, right? And some of you are probably thinking to yourself right now, you're like, well, wait a minute, they had to lose eventually, right? If they didn't lose eventually, then wouldn't they still be around? The Assyrians would fall eventually because they made too many enemies. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they made so many enemies that everyone started rebelling at the same time, and then when they all attacked and rebelled at the same time, they would eventually crumble. And a lot of this was actually instigated by a different empire known as the Persians, who we're going to be talking about next in class. The Persians actually were the ones that came in and took over the territory that was left behind by the Assyrians. And the Persians are going to spend a long time growing through that process. Under their leader Cyrus the Great, they would actually take over the areas that rebelled against the Assyrians, except they were a little bit smarter about it. So the big thing we're going to be doing is comparing the Assyrian strategy to the Persian strategy when I see y'all in class next. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.